Hello, everyone. This is going to be 3.4 Americans Win the Revolution. We're going to start with a quote from Nathan Hale, who was an American spy. Unfortunately, he was caught by the British with secret files in his shoe. And before he was hanged by the British as a spy, he said, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." And he now had a country because America won. So, our objectives: we are going to explain the advantages that the British held at the start of the war and the mistakes they made by underestimating the Patriots. We are going to describe the war in the Middle States and the frontier. We're going to assess why the British failed to win the war in the South. And we are going to describe how the British were finally defeated and the terms of the peace treaty as well. Lastly, we're going to analyze the revolution, how it affected Americans and also people around the world. So let's start with the war beginning. So, the beginning of the American Revolution, obviously, America had a very difficult road ahead. Britain had a lot more than we did. They had a lot more money. They had a already built, stable government. They had thousands of troops. They had ships. They had allies. They could buy more troops because they made deals with the Germans, German troops called Hessians. And they had supplies as well. United States had few to none of these. However, the British were also very overconfident, and you can see this at the beginning of the war. This actually does get them in trouble. Excuse me. So, at the beginning of the war, at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, technically, I guess the war hadn't even been officially started yet, but the British marched up to take Bunker or Breed's Hill outside of Boston. The Americans had fortified themselves up at the top and basically just walked up a hill, which, if you are a military tactician, you realize that's not what you should do. Never walk up a hill with a clear line of fire when your enemy is entrenched at the top of the hill. They can, shoot at you all day, and that's exactly what they did. The commander, Lord William Howe, lost many, many men, and it took 3 tries to get up Bunker Hill, and the Americans just realized that they were going to take this hill and ran away. And so they won a hill with very little value to it. So, pretty much everything you're not supposed to do in a battle. So, why did he do this? Well, he thought that the Americans were pushovers, honestly. And he also wanted to show the discipline and the fighting spirit that the British had and the Americans didn't. After Bunker Hill, however, the Patriots, otherwise known as the Whigs, that's what they called themselves, were able to use some cannons stolen from a British fort, Fort Ticonderoga, to surround Boston, and the British had to abandon the city of Boston in early 1776 and fled to New York instead. So, Lord Howe thought that they would be fighting an old school, both sides line up in a clear field and march toward each other, kind of European style war. That isn't what happened. He also thought of this almost as like capture the flag, where if he could if he could capture Philadelphia, which he viewed as the capital city of America at that time, then he had won. However, the Americans were fighting a different sort of war. We did not often, well, we did sometimes fight these sort of actual going out into the field and fighting a war like that, but we also were basing a lot of our strategy on guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics. If you are going to face your enemy, make sure that you are not facing them in an open field. Hide behind stuff, shoot them, and then run away. It was also a fight to win hearts and minds, because the longer that we survived, the longer we worked, and the more we won, the more it helped our side. In the long run, we did not have to win, we just had to make them lose. The British also angered a lot of Americans when they brought in German mercenaries known as Hessians. They were known for having a rather brutal reputation, and also it was sort of like, this was supposed to be a fight between, brothers, really. This is a fight between English people and American people, and now you brought these Germans in. So this is Lord William Howe, and he said, "The rebels did more in one night than my whole army could have done in a month." This is what he said after they surrounded Boston with cannons. And here's what a Hessian soldier looked like at the time. Interestingly enough, a lot of these Hessians were offered land by the Americans to walk away, and they did. They actually set up shop in America and never left. The Americans, although we had to face a lot of issues, the Americans did have a few things going for them. First of all, we had George Washington. Despite his very rough French and Indian War, Washington was a good leader, a trusted leader. He was seen as sort of like somebody who was had the best interests of his men at heart and was willing to go through hell with them if necessary. He also was smart enough to realize he had learned from the French and Indian War not to make the same mistakes. For instance, don't put all of your men into a fight where you have no option but to win or lose. Always have the option to retreat. He would retreat from battles so that he would uh, live to fight another day, basically. Washington fought 9 battles throughout the American Revolution, 9 major battles, and he won 3 of them. But he didn't really lose the other 6 so much as he fled the other 6 as a way to make sure that the American army would continue to fight. Now, under Washington's leadership, the army was able to hang together under brutal circumstances such as Valley Forge, which was a very dreadful winter that the American army spent in the freezing Pennsylvania. Now, for the revolution to succeed, we also needed civilians to be on our side. Most of all, we needed the help of people who were not fighting, but doing things that were helpful, such as women at that point. Women's were the ones running the farms because their husbands had left. They were making food, making clothes, sending food and clothes and gunpowder and shoes and everything else to the soldiers. There were even some women who did serve in battle, although their numbers are respectively few. They dressed in men's clothing, or in the case of one woman named Molly Pitcher, that is not her real name, but she basically she dropped everything to volunteer in the heat of battle. Her husband had been wounded, and she took up the cannon and kept it cool with her water pitcher. So she fired her husband's cannon, like I said, after he was hit at the Battle of Monmouth. Molly Pitcher became a early on female American hero. However, they did have their struggles as well. Some Americans were becoming war profiteers. Basically, in a time of crisis, the price of necessary goods goes way up. And we saw that was a problem. Another problem is inflation, the price of things going up for regular goods, because the Continental Congress was printing money that was not backed by gold. And so the price of money became practically worthless. And, it would cost something like, it would be almost like a modern day saying, $5,000 for a loaf of bread or something. It was not a good thing. Now, let's look at the war itself and tactics a little bit too. So, after the British were kicked out of Boston in early 1776, they instead went to New York City, where there was a much stronger loyalist or Tory stronghold, and over a course of battles drove the Patriots out. If you're a fan of Hamilton, this is all what's going on in the song Right Hand Man. Now, Washington and his men were pushed all the way across New Jersey, through New Jersey into Pennsylvania. And from there, the Americans eventually were able to regroup and cross back over the Delaware River into New Jersey. This is the day after Christmas, 1776. And this was a time when Washington needed a win. He really needed a win at this point because his army, their 1 year long service requirement was about to expire. And so they needed something to keep them in there. And so they attacked the Hessians at a place called Trenton in New Jersey, which is now the capital, and defeated them in battle. This was a huge morale boost. It gave Washington supplies, it gave him morale, and it kept his soldiers from just up and leaving. So here's Washington crossing the Delaware River to attack Trenton. This is on December 25th, 1776. And future President James Monroe is the guy holding the flag there behind Washington. This is the leader of the Hessians at Trenton, Johann Rall. Johann Rall was a colonel in charge of the Hessians. He died from a bullet wound at the Battle of Trenton, but he also died because he did not read a note that he was given that said the Americans are coming tomorrow while he was playing cards. The note was found on his body the next day after he had died. After Trenton, Washington won again at Princeton, defeating another British general named Charles Cornwallis. After this, though, there was a lot of tough times for Washington where he was stuck in in Saratoga, or not. I'm sorry, he was stuck in Pennsylvania. Um, there was not a lot of good for the American army until there was an American force that defeated a British army at Saratoga in New York. This, by the way, was not George Washington. This was General Horatio Gates. But they defeated the British at Saratoga, and it was a really important battle because our victory at Saratoga was the one that convinced the French, excuse me, to come and join support American independence. So now we had the French on our side, giving money and troops and weapons. So this is the Saratoga campaign. Saratoga was fought in September through October of 1777. Now, why was France willing to come and join our battle? Well, because they wanted to defeat Great Britain. They were still smarting from the French and Indian / 7 Years' War, and it took a little convincing to get them on our side. The Saratoga convinced them that America could win, though. There also had been a few French volunteers who had come over to help fight and were also pleading for French intervention. Also, we had Benjamin Franklin over there pleading for French intervention as well. But one of the most effective pleaders for the American cause was an 18-year-old kid, the Marquis de Lafayette, who became one of Washington's aides-de-camp, right-hand mans in camp. He also was a young French nobleman who had the ear of the king. So this is the Marquis de Lafayette, 1757 to 1834. He was born in France. He was a soldier and an aristocrat and a revolutionary. His full name actually is Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert de Montier, which is why I don't take French. He is also the hero of the French Revolution and the other French Revolution as well. He survived 3 different revolutions. And he once said, when the government violates the people, I'm not going to do this in a French accent, when the government violates the people's rights, insurrection is, for the people, the most sacred of the rights and the most indispensable of duties. Now, like I said, Ben Franklin was also over there getting the French on our side. Franklin was the closest thing that we had to an American celebrity at that time. He was world famous in Paris. He was beloved by the Enlightenment folks. He also worked to improve our relations between the countries. He was a charmer. He knew how to charm people. And he also dressed very simply to kind of give the idea of, this is what America's like. Yes, we are not highfalutin. We are not rich and powerful. We are instead backwoods, homespun, but brilliant at the same time. He is famous for wearing a simple 3-piece suit and beaver hat and wearing a cane instead of a sword. And this won the French over. So here is Ben Franklin in Paris with his hat, and now we all know what happened to poor Evil Beaver's granddad. Now, France, on the other hand, sent money and soldiers and guns and ships, and so the balance shifted into American favor. Spain also joined the American side in 1779 for the same reasons. They were wanting to kind of get back at the English and also to expand their own colonial territory here in America. Now, they were not officially an ally, but they did keep the British from entering New Orleans, keeping them off the Mississippi, which was a great way to, move stuff. Now, why? Partially because, they didn't like the British, but they also were hoping to get a little land out of it, too. So, Washington's low point probably was in 1777 and 78, before the French got there. He and his men are stuck in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia. They're freezing to death and starving to death, but Washington is right there with them, freezing and starving along with them, and they persisted. This is also, they spent the winter drilling and learning how to become a strong, effective fighting unit. And this is partially due to a German volunteer, the Baron von Steuben. Von Steuben was a professional soldier who joined the Americans. Franklin actually recommended him, but we do see that we're getting some help from people over in Europe as well. So here is the Baron drilling the American troops in Valley Forge in 1777-78. In 1778, the British evacuated Philadelphia and headed back to New York City. New York kind of became their stronghold for a lot of the war. On the way, they had to fight off the Americans at the Battle of Monmouth, which was not a victory for the Americans so much as it was a draw. Both sides were, dropping from heat, exhaustion, and bullets, and it was a very hot day. However, it did show that Americans could hold their own. So here's the Battle of Monmouth. Now we were also fighting west as well. In the Ohio River Valley, the revolution was mainly fought between settlers and native tribes. The tribes had mainly allied with the British because of how the Americans had sort of treated them badly over the years. We did have a few native tribes on our side, but mainly this was native tribes versus the British, or versus the Americans. And they were, both sides were attacking civilians, they were attacking non combatants, and this was a very long, bloody cycle of attacks and revenge in the West. Also in the West being Indiana and Illinois at this time, American militias, led by a guy named George Clark, captured British forts, British trading posts, and the city of Cahokia, Illinois. So that's way out west. This is the frontier right now. American victories did help the settlers to claim the Ohio River Valley as American after the war. So here's George Clark marching on Vincennes, Indiana during that time. And lastly, let's look at the war in the South. So, Great Britain first tried to cut off New England and Boston from the rest of America. It didn't work. So then they tried to win in the middle colonies. It didn't work there after the Battle of Saratoga. And the Battle of Monmouth didn't work either. So they decided to turn their attention to the South, where they believed that they would have a lot of loyalist support. And they did. And the British were winning a lot of battles, but they couldn't hold on to a lot of local support down there because the loyalists were mainly sort of backwoods, very poor loyalists, and they tended to take bloody revenge on the more wealthy patriots who they were not fans of. And so this became a very blood-soaked battle, and it didn't win them a lot of friends in the South. The Americans also were really good at wearing them down. So the Americans just would not stop and fight in a straight up battle, and they would fall back instead and fall back again. And eventually, the British were just losing men and losing supplies and losing morale, really. Now, this is a bit tough to follow that the Americans are doing that on purpose. Nathaniel Greene, especially, was leading the British on a merry chase through the South. Now, in the southern countryside, the revolution became a civil war. Like I said, the Patriot and Loyalist militias were pretty brutal towards each other. But eventually, the Americans won a battle against the Loyalist at Kings Mountain in South Carolina. And the more the Americans won, the more Southerners joined the American side. And like I said, Nathaniel Greene, who's one of my favorites from the American Revolution because this is beautiful battle strategy. He went into the South and lost every battle and won the South. That is amazing because he basically would retreat and fight and retreat and fight and retreat, keeping his men's numbers high so that the British would have to chase him, lose men, go away from their supply lines, and eventually Cornwallis had to stop and retreat to Virginia to resupply at a place called Yorktown. So, Nathaniel Greene once said, I run as fast backwards as forwards to convince our enemy that we are like a crab. We can run in any direction as long as it is away. Great quote. So, let's look at Yorktown and the conclusion of the war. So, Cornwallis and his men marched into Yorktown, which is on the James River. His goal was to resupply. He was short on manpower, short on supplies after the Southern campaign. However, Washington, again, this is something that Washington learned is, okay, I've been saving up my men, I've been retreating, I've been fighting very carefully. Now is the moment, and this was the moment that Washington, grabbed this advantage and took it. He very quickly surrounded the British with his French allies, and the French also sent a fleet into the York River to block them there, too. And so Cornwallis and his men are trapped in Yorktown, and the French and the Americans are slowly encircling it and squeezing in and squeezing in and squeezing in until finally Cornwallis was forced to surrender in October of 1781. So this is the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. This is an example of siege warfare where you surround the enemy and you wait them out. This took us until 1781. After the Battle of Yorktown, the war was more or less over. The British returned to England. The English people elected a new parliament that was much more for negotiating a peace. And it took 2 years, but we did negotiate a peace. It took over 200 battles and skirmishes, the loss of thousands, both due to gunshots and illness. And the British were basically tired of fighting at this point. The new parliament elected a peace forward group. And so the British and the Americans met in Paris, or right outside Paris in Versailles, and signed the Treaty of Paris. England had to recognize the independence of America and gave America lots of new land in the West. So here are the Americans at the Treaty of Paris. You can see Ben Franklin, John Adams is there, John Jay, several other people. But the British delegates refused to sit for the portrait. That's why you can only see the Americans. Now, this is America both before and after the Revolution. You might notice that our territory got bigger during this time, quite a bit bigger, like it exists now. Now, lastly, let's look at the impact of this revolution. It changed the world in a lot of different ways, turned the world upside down. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep quoting Hamilton until the day I die. A group of colonies, small group of smaller colonies, had defeated their much more powerful mother country, and that had not happened in a long time. The Americans were also calling for a more open and equal society with the people in charge and not a king. We'll talk about what kind of leadership they thought of afterwards. But for the British, loyalist families had to leave America. Their lives could be in danger, so many of them fled to Canada. Many fled to England. Some fled to the Caribbean. About 90,000 loyalists, including 20,000 former enslaved people, fled the United States. The enslaved people had been leaving with the hope that if the British won, they would be given their freedom. However, some enslaved people who fought for the British were in fact re-enslaved in the Caribbean instead. Native American tribes were abandoned by their British allies, and they were not covered in the Treaty of Paris, and so they had to sign their own treaties with the Americans. These treaties often forced large amounts of consequences for the natives. They had to give up most of their land. So they started to head west into places like Kentucky and Tennessee. So after the British lost, the natives were forced to deal with the consequences. Now, women did not get many new rights following this war. All men are created equal, but they were not mentioned in the Declaration or anywhere else. A few did begin to advocate for their rights, though, saying that they were as much part of the success of the war, they deserved to be remembered after it. We'll talk a bit about Abigail Adams's Remember the Ladies letter. However, women didn't gain many rights from the war. Here, by the way, is Abigail Adams, 1744 to 1818 from Massachusetts. She is the First Lady of the United States, the second one we had after Martha Washington. She's also the first one to live in the White House. The White House had not been built yet. She was a close advisor to her husband and actually handled his financial affairs. And allegedly, since we're in the middle of October, her ghost is occasionally seen at the White House, hanging laundry in the East Room. Abigail Adams said, "If we mean to have heroes, statesmen, and philosophers, we should have learned, intelligent women." Now, to many, we are talking about African Americans and enslaved people, slavery sort of seemed to be against the idea of all men being created equal. I mean, it's right there. Why should we have an enslaved people after that? And yeah, we were called on it by the British. It was mocked as hypocrisy that we were willing to have enslaved people and yet call for liberty. And we even occasionally used slavery as, part of the when we talked about Americans, we were saying we were being enslaved by the king. And so we were using slavery as a metaphor and at the same time holding actual enslaved people. It continued. The revolution did lead to freedom for some slaves in the North. This is known as manumission, especially in New England, where slavery hadn't been very big in the first place. Massachusetts, especially, very quickly figured out that, yes, slavery doesn't exactly vibe with the ideas of a free America. And so Elizabeth Freeman, aka Mum Bet, sued for her freedom in Massachusetts and won, and this was the beginning of outlawing slavery in Massachusetts, and many other states in the North followed suit. However, in the South, slavery held very fast. It was still a big thing. Some planters did free their own slaves. This was known as manumission, but most did not. And Southern slaves actually passed laws discouraging this. By 1810, there were still about 20,000 Southern enslaved people who had been freed, but the number of enslaved people well outnumbered the number of free people who had been freed. We still see they made up about 1/3 of the Southern population. Now, the other big thing is that this was not just contained to America. The idea of revolutionary ideas spread throughout the world, across the centuries even. American Revolution helped to bring about the French Revolution, and the Declaration of Independence has been quoted by men and women working for rights for their particular groups. African American abolitionists have quoted it. The women at Seneca Falls directly quoted it. Native Americans quoted it. Women's rights activists quoted it. People in Vietnam and France and Russia have all taken the Declaration as sort of their founding document to talk about the freedoms of men and women in this situation. And so we'll see that later on.